welcome to the Chief Science Officers Zoom In on Science Calls, where we learn about STEM professionals and their careers to understand the impact of their job in modern life. My name is CSO Vivek Raj from Kenya. I'm personally excited to host today's call. So, for all of us to enjoy this experience, please mute your microphones and post your questions at any time during the presentation in the chat box. We welcome Alan to Zoom In on Science. Welcome, Mr. Alan.
Thank you.
Mr. Allen, can you tell our participants a little bit about yourself and your work?
Hi, everybody. My name is Alan Berman, and well, it says my internet connection's unstable, so we'll hope it stabilizes. I work for an organization called the Intercultural Center for the Study of Deserts and Oceans, and we are located in Puerto Peñasco, also known as Rocky Point, and that's about 4 hours south of the US-Mexico border in the state of Arizona in the southwestern United States. And it is in the state of Sonora, Mexico. So it's an interesting story in that there was a graduate student at the University of Arizona in Tucson named Peggy Turk Boyer, and she was studying marine biology in the 1980s, and she was doing field classes, field trips down to Mexico to study what we call the intertidal zone, which is the area between the high tide and the low tide. And the northern Sea of Cortez, or Gulf of California, as it's also known, which is that very long sea between the Mexican mainland and the Baja Peninsula, has some of the highest tidal or most extreme tidal ranges in the world. So when the tide goes out, it goes out farther than in most places in the world, which reveals the bottom of the ocean and makes it a great place to study all the animals that live in that area. A lot of intertidal invertebrates, sea stars, octopus, you name it. There's about 5,000 invertebrates in the Gulf that we know of. So she started studying little snails and whatnot in the intertidal, and then she realized that there were some major conservation issues. So issues that have to do with managing the natural resources. About 70% of the fish that's consumed and seafood that's consumed in Mexico comes from the Gulf of California. After realizing that these fisheries resources were actually endangered and declining, Peggy decided that she was going to stay in Mexico. And if you see this building down here, that's what CEDO looks like from the front. It's built on the sand dunes right on the beach there. And it was an abandoned building, and she decided to stay there with her boyfriend and start hosting students from Arizona. And eventually she built this nonprofit organization. And a nonprofit organization is basically, it's a charitable organization. So we get money from grants from big corporations like the Walmart's Family Foundation, and from the government as well. And then we get individual donations from our supporters. And they support us in order to do all kinds of different work. And we're sort of unique in that we do a lot of different kinds of environmental work that involves research and fisheries science. It involves education as well. It involves capacity building in the community. So helping local people understand and manage their resources. And we do some other unique things, like we do ecotourism. We host visitors and we show them around some of the more special places of the desert and ocean that we love to share about. So what is CEDO? So we are a field station, which means we host school groups. So right now, obviously we can't because of COVID, but as soon as we open back up again, if you're part of a group, whether it be a school group or some other kind of group from anywhere in the world, you can come and visit us and stay there. We have a community campus. So our campus is quite a special place. It's famous for having this giant whale skeleton out front. And we have little ponds as well that we created for some endangered desert fish. And anyone is welcome to stop by at the campus, and we give free natural history talks to the public. So if you're a volunteer with CEDO, one thing you can do is help show people around and give those talks. We also have an ocean camp for younger kids, and And then on top of that, like I said, we're a research facility. So fisheries science has kind of been our foundation since the very beginning. The founder I told you about, Peggy, she did the first mortality study on the world's most endangered marine mammal, the vaquita marina, back in the 80s. And she had to sort of create her own computer language and program in order to do this study. So it's pretty impressive stuff back in the day. And a lot of this science is based on talking to fishermen and getting fishermen involved in helping us collect the data. So giving them logbooks so that they can log their catch and things like bycatch, and really getting them to actively participate in collecting information about their resources. And that not only does it give us better data, but it also really empowers them. They feel more confident and more knowledgeable about their resources, and then they're better able to participate in managing them and working with scientists and government authorities to create a better management system, because it's kind of a free-for-all. It's always been a free-for-all when it comes to fisheries in most of the world, especially the smaller scale fisheries. It's a very broken system, and it's just not working. So the best way to fix it is to get the local people who depend on it the most involved in managing it. And like I said, we are a nonprofit organization, and we're unique in that we're binational. So we actually have nonprofit status both in Mexico and the United States. And that's very cool because we can share knowledge across the border. So knowledge and resources. So we can, for example, we can accept donations in the United States that are used for programs in Mexico. And we can host researchers from the United States and Mexico and vice versa. We can have educational competitions that involve schools on both sides of the border, et cetera. And this is just a little map of where CEDO is located. As you can see, it's a very desert habitat. And what makes it very unique is that it's really where the Sonoran Desert, which is one of the most incredible desert habitats in the world, meets the Sea of Cortez or the Gulf of California, like I said. So in the desert part, there's like very cool sand dunes, volcanoes, an incredible ecosystem. And then the Gulf of California, Jacques Cousteau called it the aquarium of the world back in the 70s because of the huge amount of biodiversity that can be found there, including a lot of the whales and dolphins that are found in the world, deep sea trenches where, you can take those submarines down to the hydrothermal vents and that. Tons of different fish, invertebrates, seabirds, sea turtles, you name it. It probably exists in the Gulf of California. So do you guys have any questions?
Thank you very much for telling us about your work. Mr. Allen, it's truly evident you're truly passionate while we are learning about what you do. Participants have left questions in the chat box, but let's first with my questions I've prepared. Who was your mentor as a child?
I think I got into science and conservation through my parents because they would take us hiking in the national parks here in the States. We have a very robust network of protected areas, places like Yellowstone National Park. And then more recently, I got to study at a field station. My college had a field station in the Gulf of California, a little bit south of CEDO in a place called Kino Bay. And my teachers there were very important mentors. And that's kind of where I realized that I could be involved in marine conservation and science. Even though I'm not a very sciencey person, I actually studied art as well. My strengths are more in art and writing and communication. But I realized that those skills are also needed in order to communicate science to a wider public. And so a big part of my role at CEDO is doing that, is writing about the work that other people are doing so that a wider audience understands why it's important and how they can get involved as well.
It's a great answer. Let's go to the second question which I've prepared. What advice would you give to your 14-year-old self?
My 14-year-old self?
Yeah.
That's a tough question. I was very lucky in that I was able to explore a lot of different fields and find out what I most enjoyed doing. Um, but I guess the advice I would give is to once you find out what you're interested in, um, if you just dedicate a little bit of time to it every day, you can really become an expert in anything you want relatively quickly. So, um, looking back, if I was 14 years old and I decided that I was going to dedicate an hour a day learning about marine biology and conservation, I would be a much wiser person right now. So that's probably what I would advise myself.
Yeah, so let's go to the participant questions. Thanks for your answers for my question. So the first question is from Kelly, Miss Kelly from CSO International.
Mhm.
Alan, what is your favorite part of your job?
My favorite part of my job, well, I have to say that I always loved being out in the field, and I think a lot of people do. Um, the field work is exciting. You're out there, you're in touch, you're doing hands-on stuff in nature. I think the more you do it, the more you realize just how difficult it is. It can be very challenging to work outdoors long hours, day after day. um, I spent about a year diving every day a few years back, doing coral reef restoration, for example. And I loved it. I spent about 8 hours underwater every day, but at the same time, there was sicknesses that were involved with that. There was you get very tired. um, so field work is still my passion, but I've also realized that not only is it very difficult, but you can also uh, there's a lot of other ways that a lot of other things that need to happen. So like right now, I spend a lot of time fundraising for these projects. So if nobody's out there, raising the money to do the field work, then the field work's just not going to happen. But like I said, what I've always enjoyed most is being outside, and I love anything that has to do with writing and art as well. So on my free time, uh, I'm writing books, educational books, using my own illustrations about some of the science that I love.
Yeah, thanks for that. Such a awesome answer. Let's go to the next question, which is from CSO Haley from Oregon. What is your favorite branch of science and why?
My favorite branch of science. Well, because I'm not a very mathematical person, I always found the microbiology to be very difficult. Both my parents were microbiologists, and it's very fascinating. But it's I've always found that difficult to understand, and I've always found the statistics very difficult to understand. And but I've also just gained an appreciation for how important math and statistics are in science. So um, you can collect a lot of really great data, but and a lot of people are really good at collecting it. But once you have that data, what are you going to do with it? You need somebody that is able to analyze it in creative ways, and very purposeful ways in order to apply it to something, to use it. Um, so I guess to answer the question, my favorite part is thinking about the big picture and thinking about how science applies to things like protecting the natural world, conservation. Traditionally, a lot of science was just done for the sake of science. But if you're learning something new and you're proving something, then it counts as good science and it's worth doing. But as we're in this biodiversity crisis, as climate change is starting to impact us really heavily, it's becoming clearer and clearer that we need to do science with a purpose. We need to do science in order to manage our natural resources, to mitigate the impacts of climate change, to help vulnerable communities. So my favorite part about science is thinking about how it can be applied to sort of real world problems.
Raj, you're muted. Try again.
I guess. That's a great answer. So let's keep to the next question, which is from Liza from Science Tech Institute. Alan, I know that conservation of critically endangered vaquita can sometimes lead to conflict with local people who count on fishing for their income. What has been your experience with this?
Yeah, the Vaquita is, if you guys aren't familiar with that story, it's very much worth looking into. It sort of embodies um, the entire a lot of the challenges with doing marine conservation. So the Vaquita is a tiny porpoise. It's like a dolphin, and there was very few of them, and they were endemic. They lived only in the northern Gulf of California in a very small area. And there was another species called the totuaba, which is a giant sea bass. And there's always been a market for the totuaba for an organ called the swim bladder specifically. And that was marketed to China, where it's used as a traditional medicine. So since the 1920s, there was a market for this organ, and totuaba has been fished. But because of that, the fish got really overfished, and it became illegal to fish the totuaba. And then more recently, so starting in the 80s, but really picking up around 2015, this market in China for the swim bladder of this fish really boomed. So the fishermen started getting really high prices for fishing this fish, and they would waste most of the fish, which has really excellent meat for eating. They would just take the swim bladder. And they were doing it illegally because the fish is endangered, and they weren't allowed to fish it. And so as a result of that, the nets that they put out to fish the totuaba, these little dolphins were getting tangled up in the nets and drowning and dying. And the dolphins are very smart and very able to avoid nets, but there's just so many of these nets in their little habitat that there's nowhere for them to go. So even if they're being killed off sort of gradually, the population has just declined drastically, and now there's only about 11 of these animals left, of the vaquita left. Whereas the totuaba population seems to be more or less stable. People still have concerns about legalizing that fishery, but it's really the vaquita that's suffering, and we call that bycatch. So it's an incidental capture. The fishermen are not trying to kill vaquita, but they're getting tangled up in the nets and dying. So there's so many issues surrounding this. There's scientists and there's citizens that want to protect the vaquita and the totuaba, but there's also these hundreds and hundreds of fishermen in these communities that need to make a living and need to survive. Another element that was introduced was the organized crime. So because there's so much money in the totuaba trade, the drug cartels got involved, and now they're running the illegal fishery. So if you're a fisherman in these communities, you don't have a lot of options. Sometimes the only choices you have are to starve to death, or maybe migrate illegally to the United States, or to get involved in this illegal fishery with the mafia, who's actively exploiting you and threatening your life, and kidnapping your family and this and that. And there's a lot of conflict there. There's a documentary about it called Sea of Shadows, and it doesn't do a great job of showing the fisherman's perspective, but it does a pretty good job of sort of showing the whole issue. And those of you in Africa will be familiar with the ivory trade and similar situations. And so it's important to realize that those kind of situations also occur in the ocean with fisheries. I don't know if that answered your question, but I'm not sure how informed you guys are about the issue. So I would definitely suggest just reading a little bit about it. There's a lot on our website, and definitely watch the documentary Sea of Shadows if you can.
Yeah, actually, I guess that's fine. That's a very nice answer according to me. Let's get to the next question, which is from the same person, Lisa from Science Tech Institute. Have you seen the documentary Sauce, Sea of Shadows? Were you involved in any events that they discussed?
Yeah, so that's the documentary that I recommended. And CEDO has just been involved from the very beginning, because we used to find vaquitas that would wash up on our beaches. Somebody brought a baby vaquita to our field station once, and we tried to keep it alive for a little bit, and it died in somebody's arms there in a tank. And then, like I said, Peggy did the first mortality study on them. And Puerto Penasco, the fishing community that we work with primarily, is one of the 3 communities that's involved in these northern Gulf fisheries, including the illegal Totuaba fishery. So yeah, we've been present throughout the whole thing, and we've seen a lot of the violence that's associated with the organized crime. And we've had staff members that have lost family members to that violence and that kind of thing. So we're right there in the heart of that issue. And there's the main people doing the science right now, though. They're called CIRVA, CIRVA, the International Commission for the Recovery of Vaquita. And they do annual studies. And the cool thing about one of the nice things of the story is that some of the science they do is just absolutely remarkable. So in order to find out how many vaquita are left in these murky waters that are vaquita are very, very hard to spot. They're very shy, and they live in very murky waters. So most fishermen have not ever seen a vaquita. A lot of them deny their existence even. And most researchers have not seen vaquita. So the reason that we have such good data on how many are out there and how they're reproducing and all is thanks to this amazing technology. So they use these hydroacoustic buoys where they can record their sonar underwater, and they have these amazing networks of buoys. And then we also work with fishermen to report vaquita bycatch, but of course that's not always the most effective thing. But yeah, some of the science that has been done is truly remarkable. So you can also check out CIRVA's website.
Yeah, sure, we would do that. And this is in continuation to the question, which is from Lisa Science Tech Institute. Alan, did you go to the Prescott College for Kino Bay?
Yes, I did. So I was interested in studying art as well as marine biology. So my dad introduced me to scuba diving, and I knew that I wanted to do something that had to do with marine biology and the ocean because I had a passion for it. But like I said, I really loved art. So I found Prescott College, which is a school in here in Arizona, and they had a double major where you could do art and marine studies. So I spent half the time in Arizona doing art and then half the time at a field station in Kino Bay. And it's just one of the most magical places in the world down there. It's next to the largest island in the Pacific, Shark Island. And it's all just complete wilderness. The land itself is owned by an indigenous group called the Seri or the Kunkak. So we actually had an indigenous guide that would show us things in the desert and the estuaries and the wetlands and in the water. So we got to experience what an indigenous community looks like, learn from them. And the field station also had boats that would take us out to some of these islands in the middle of the Gulf of California. And they're like prehistoric islands. They're these giant whitewashed rocks in the middle of the ocean where you have pods of sperm whales around you. We would get charged by sperm whales on the little boats. You'd have these fin whales that would race by you and pop up next to your boat. We would get to go snorkeling with hundreds of baby sea lions that would mimic you and swim around you and play with you. And then the islands are just covered in seabirds, birds like the red-billed tropic bird, which is a giant tern with a very long tail that has this very Jurassic Park sounding shriek. And there'd just be hundreds of these flying through the air. So really it's a ecosystem and a habitat like nowhere else in the world. And we were so lucky to get to experience that at a young age. And that's really what inspired my passion around marine conservation.
Yeah, so that's a great answer. Let's skip to the next question, which is from CSO Chebeni from Kenya. In your opinion, what's the most interesting project or job that you have done?
The most interesting, I really liked that job I was telling you about that had to do with coral restoration. So for those not very familiar with the issue, climate change is really devastating coral reefs around the world. And these are some of the most productive habitats. So they're habitats that are responsible for a huge amount of biodiversity and a huge amount of productivity when it comes to fisheries. Coral reefs are made of these organisms that they're part animal, part plant, because they have algae living inside them, and they live in these very specific low nutrient conditions at very specific temperatures. So if those temperatures are altered just a little bit, and right now they're being altered a lot by climate change, what happens is the algae living inside the coral fails and leaves the coral, and the coral dies. So it's really an ecological crisis. And this job that I had involved growing corals in nurseries underwater. And then we would break off pieces of those and then transplant them on a boat to different parts of the reef, and actually nail them onto the reef, and then do some science around it, figuring out how long it takes them to grow and how successful different genotypes, so corals of the same species but with slightly different genetic makeup, how these different genotypes would respond and which ones would do better. And there's a lot of corollary projects that are interesting, like here at Biosphere 2, which is in Tucson. There is the biggest tank in the world, saltwater tank. So it's like an artificial ocean in the desert. It's pretty crazy. And what they're doing there is they're planting corals, and then they're changing the acidification and the temperature of the water. So in addition to temperature changes with climate change, the water is also becoming more acidic due to the carbon dioxide that the ocean is saturated with. And so they're doing this big experiment there to figure out, once again, which genotypes, which species of corals are most resilient to climate change. And so that way we can focus our conservation priorities around those, and maybe even help restore reefs by planting some of these corals. So I guess because of the scope of the project and because a lot of the research was done while you're scuba diving, it was, and also we got to involve like tourists on the beach who we created a PADI dive certification around coral restoration, where people could be certified in helping to plant corals and that kind of thing. So that was my favorite project I've worked on so far. You're muted.
So I wanted to just quickly say, Alan, thank you so much. We are coming up on that 30 minutes, but I know Raj has a couple more questions. Are you willing to answer a couple more?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So this is a question from Shelley Clemens. What keeps you passionate?
That's a good question. I think every once in a while, I'm here. It's funny because I'm here in the desert and I'm talking about work in the ocean, which is about 4 hours away. So every once in a while, I need to go down to the ocean. That place in Kino Bay that I told you about, where I did my undergrad studies, I visited it recently, and I hired the Panga, the motorboat, with our local captain, who used to be a fisherman, to take me out to the island and do some snorkeling. And we found a sea turtle, and he actually grabbed it and brought it up on board in order to tag it and take some measurements on it. So any of that hands-on stuff where you're actually experiencing the ecosystem and the people that live around it, that's what keeps inspiring me. And not to mention, there's just so much bad news in the world when it comes to the environment. There's a sense of urgency right now that I don't think we've ever experienced before. And you have to maintain optimism and motivation and a little bit of hope to sort of push back against that.
That's such an informative answer. Let's go to the next question, which is an interesting question from CSO Josh. How is coronavirus affecting marine biology?
Well, it's very early to be able to, make any real predictions or anything like that. But I'll take the opportunity to just talk about how a lot of the work that we do at CEDO, some of it is more for the love of animals. Like one thing that we do is we're helping rescue sea lions that become entangled in fishing nets. So there's sea lions that are being choked by this fishing gear, and we're trying to go in and cut the nets off their necks and save them. And last year we were able to save 5 sea lions. So that's work that's sort of for the love of the animals, but you might not consider it sort of critical work on a bigger scale, whereas some of the work we do has to do with managing thousands upon thousands of small scale fishermen and getting them to fish more sustainably. And that really has local, national, global impacts on the ocean. So my point was that a lot of the work that we do is really essential, critical work. And yet it's being done by nonprofits, which means that we have to go out there and ask for money to do this work. And when you have something like COVID, what happens is that there's an economic depression and there's less money available to do this really important work. And it makes you realize that, if that money stops coming in, if those grants stop coming in, that absolutely necessary work just doesn't get done. And I was really surprised to learn that, in Europe and other countries, they don't even have nonprofit organizations. And the reason is they realize that the work is so important that it needs to get done, whether or not some generous philanthropist is willing to fund it or not, or some corporation. So, so who does it in Europe? The government does it. They have better government programs, and they're the ones that take on the responsibility. So I think it's an important lesson that we're learning. A lot of the lessons that we're learning around coronavirus are just that our system, if something affects our system like this, a lot of things just fall through the cracks, and our government's just not there to do the work that needs to be done, whether it's supporting environmental projects or helping people.
That's an informative answer to this situation. So let's close today's call. Thank you very much for your participation today. Before we close this call, I have a small question for you. What advice would you give to us as young leaders for our future?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's very cool to talk to people from all over the world. And I would say, my advice is just to keep exploring and don't set any limits for yourself. So it's always important to think about your career and how much money you're going to make and that kind of thing. But at the same time, it's a great big world out there, and there are a lot of opportunities for people that go after them and work hard. So yeah, just don't set yourself any limitations. Don't think that because you're bad at math you can't do science, or because you're not a good writer that you're not going to be able to communicate science in some way. And then one of the some of the advice that I got in my undergrad that was very powerful is also just use your strengths. So if you are really good at one thing, focus on that and figure out how you can contribute to science and conservation by using your strength. So in my example, once again, I like to do art and writing. So I've gone more towards the science communication part, communicating science, versus doing the more complex statistical analysis, which I kind of learned early on that I wasn't going to be the best at. So hope that works.
For their answer. That's our pleasure to be with you. Again, we thank you for joining us today, Alan. You are an inspiration to many of us, and we hope that you can participate in another call someday. as we continue to zoom in on STEM. CSOs, please unmute your microphones and we will close with our motto. CSOs, don't just hope it happens.
Make it happen.
Make it happen.
You were a wonderful guest, Mr. Allen. Thanks, Alan. Great call. Have a wonderful day. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Ellen.
Sure thing.
Great job, Vivica. Bye, everybody.